Okay, very good evening. I'm the last one of the presenters this evening, so there'll be a little bit of repetition with some of the fantastic images I've seen so far. My job this evening is to talk to you about the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. So I think we're seeing quite a bit of concentration in the southern half of the UK so far this evening. I loved sort of Tom's point on the some of the cetaceans, and I should be touching on some of that as well. But the Ardnamurchan Peninsula is up in the northwest of Scotland. So basically get to Glasgow and then go up a bit and off to the left. So it's a lovely area which in the last few years has been a particular favourite for nature trekkers. And we've probably run more sort of 8-day tours up there than anywhere else in the UK, and probably in fact anywhere else in Europe. And they've proved to be very popular pre and post pandemic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it. What we do generally on these tours, which run through roughly from May through to about October, is that we tend to meet up with everybody at Glasgow, and then we have a drive out, and this is down to your tour leaders to do, to drive you out of Glasgow through some of the most prettiest and amazing landscapes in Scotland, really. So you're going to go past places like Loch Lomond, Rannoch Moor, and then this picture shows Glencoe, and out to Loch Lynn and onto Strontian before we actually hit the Ardnamurchan Peninsula itself. So straight away into some really fabulous countryside. And if you're like me, then although I do love wildernesses and we don't have those anymore in the UK, I think the Ardnamurchan and northwest Scotland really typifies the closest we can actually see to some really wild habitat. So we drive out to Glenborrow, and this is Glenborrow Castle, which hopefully you can see. And we don't actually stay in the castle, sadly. We're just around the corner in a place called a bunkhouse, which doesn't sound very amazing, but in actual fact, it's a very comfortable setup with ensuite rooms. And we actually have caterers coming in to look after us during the course of our tour. Anything we can do possibly to spend as much time out looking for the wonderful wildlife in this area, rather than actually making and producing our food ourselves. So halfway along the peninsula, Glenborrow is an ideal spot. And from here, we strike out and look at some of the amazing landscapes. Of course, northwest Scotland can get quite a bit of rain, and sometimes it's quite challenging with the weather, but we do get some amazing days like this. And this typifies the scene there during sort of late spring and early summer and into early autumn. This is Loch Sunart, which is a big sea loch, wonderful place, which actually has its own chemistry of wildlife. You don't even need to go out of Loch Sunart to see an awful lot of sea life. We're actually in Lager Bay here, looking down onto the shore. The little boat down there on the right-hand side is one of the boats we often use to cruise out onto the lochs to see some of the specialities close up. So we're up in northwest Scotland. So what does this show us? Well, it shows us a little bit of a temperate rainforest that in actual fact can be found in this part of the world. So some of it is over in Ireland, and then the rest of it pretty much is sort of moving up through North Wales and up into the northwest of Scotland, which is a stronghold of the Sunart rainforest, this area is called. And perhaps the best examples is Arundel Wood, which we visit on most of the tours. As you can probably see, even in this picture, which is before the proper burst of oak leaves are coming out, you can see there's an awful lot of lichens, bryophytes, all living on top of each other. And even though it may not be warm and humid, it is very much a rainforest. So anybody who loves greenery and loves things hanging off each other, absolutely lovely place to visit. And of course, in the spring and early summer, lots of singing wild birds in those woods as well. Okay, so what's the Ardnamurchan all about? How did it get its name, etc.? Well, people always think of Land's End in Cornwall as being the furthest point of the mainland. But in reality, if you look at your map, you'll see that the Ardnamurchan point actually stretches further west than even Land's End. So it's the, if you like, the furthest point of the western mainland of the UK. And it's typified by the lighthouse that sits on the end. And as in all lighthouses in the UK now, it's automated. And we do make a point of going here because it's a great place to look out over to the Hebridean Sea and looking at the small isles and all the other islands that are dotted out in front of us, as well as a place to looking for seabirds and any moving sea mammals. Should also add that we normally find time to have a tour of the Lighthouse, which is a really good tour with a very enthusiastic guy there that takes us around and shows a little bit about it. Okay, the monarch of the Glen then. So yeah, we've seen some red deer already on the previous presentations. We've got a lot of red deer in this part of the world. This is a particularly large animal, this individual, 16-pointer stag. And yes, there are large numbers of red deer on the moors here. We don't have any problem seeing red deer. They're the easiest of the deer to see. And most of the tours actually make a point of looking for these large animals. In the autumn, some of the tours are actually associated with the deer rut itself. So slightly shorter tours, about 5 days long, where we'll concentrate on looking at the red deer rutting at that time of the year. The deer share the hills and the moors with the sheep, little tiny dots these are. Where I'm living in Northamptonshire at the moment, the first sort of spring lambs are bouncing around already. But up here in Scotland, the lambs don't get going until much later on. So you'll be here in May and see little tiny dots like these. So yeah, so a lot of hill farming going on up here as well. And these sheep and lambs are not in conflict with the deer in any way, shape or form. If you like being out in the countryside, just occasionally you see a really rare sight. These aren't particularly rare, but for me, a couple of years ago, we were up on the Ardnamurchan, walked out from our accommodation down to Loch Sunart, down to the infamous aperitif point to try and find otters. And we came across this group of long-tailed tits, which had just emerged out of the nest. And if people don't know, long-tailed tits in the first hour of fledging all line up with their bums and their faces all sticking out in different directions. And for me, this was the high point of the tour, actually witnessing, and we saw it twice in 2 different tours about 2 years ago. So sorry, just a little thing from me, which I really enjoyed. So while we're on these tours, particularly the spring tours, what we endeavour to do is take a couple of boat trips out. We go beyond Loch Sunart, and if we can, we'll pop round to some lovely islands nearby. Some of the islands we visit are the Treshnish Islands, which are particularly good for seabirds. But you've got to visit Staffa, this wonderful island with the basalt columns, wonderful scenery, quite unique in many respects for Scotland. The same sort of structures you'll see in Iceland, and also Giant's Causeway across the way. You might just better pick out the people walking down the side here to get an idea of the size relationship. But every year I've done this tour, we've always managed to land on Staffa, get an opportunity of walking around to Fingal's Cave, and then walking up on top of the island. And then we move on for a 20-minute boat ride over to the Treshnish Isles, and particularly Lunga, which is the really good seabird station. Wherever we are on this tour, on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, we're never far from the sea. And so we get birds like rock pipits, which are always sharing the habitat with us. Fabulous little birds, tough little things, always live on the seashore and give us good views. And of course, you can't ignore the puffins. And up in this part of the world, the puffins are still in reasonable numbers, don't seem to be suffering from some of the crashes we've seen elsewhere. What can be better than a load of puffins sitting on some thrift? They call them the clown of the seas. I think they're really amazing. I suppose it's the eyes that call them the clown, but we do get very, very close to puffins on Lunga, almost touching distance. Can be a bit of an issue getting onto Lunga with some slippery rocks, but our boat operators are very skilled, and we've never had an accident, and people are just thrilled to get really close to these wonderful birds. And other birds exist on Lunga and on these other islands, including things like razorbills, which I think are just as good looking as puffins with that mustard yellow gape. And you get the big bruisers out there as well, the great skewers or the bonxes. Don't breed in large numbers, and sadly one of the birds that's been very, very adversely affected by bird flu during 2022. But I'm quite sure these birds will bounce back, and I'm sure that future trips out to the Ardnamurchan and to the islands out here will come across these big brown skewers. Okay, Tom in particular mentioned cetaceans. Matt was talking about them as well. For me, I'm supposed to be a bird watcher, but I'm afraid when the cetaceans are around, the birds get ignored. So we are quite fortunate on some of these tours to come across some wonderful cetaceans. For me, bottlenose dolphin is always a great pull, which is what this animal is. Tend to be fairly shore hugging, so they keep close in round the locks. and also around the headlands, don't tend to be far out into the pelagic areas, which is where the common dolphins tend to be. Don't see them on every tour, but they are in some numbers. And like most in western areas of the UK, there are dolphins. We're quite fortunate at our accommodation at Glenborrow, in as much that we can visit there any time of day, particularly if the weather's not particularly nice, because we have bird feeding station there. We have a mammal feeding station there as well. So even if the weather's fairly miserable, we can always return back to our digs and watch siskins and tits and woodpeckers coming onto the bird feeders. And if we're lucky, a whole array of mammals too. In this part of the world, I would suggest to you that the insect population is still relatively healthy. So it's worth the while for the swallows to migrate that a little bit further and come all the way up to northwest Scotland. There's plenty of insects. And of course, there's lots of those lovely midges as well, particularly if you come in June and July. I know you all love those just as much as I do. But anyway, the swallows, I'm sure, do benefit from this mass of midges. But generally speaking, the insectivorous birds do very well, and they're not suffering the same way that we find birds perhaps in the southeast of Britain doing so. However, I think most people come to the Ardnamurchan to see the mammals. And what can be more iconic to this part of the world than the wonderful pine marten? Certainly one of my favourite animals. I do love the mustelid family, and I think this is probably about the best of the lot, really. You could argue whether a pine marten or an otter is better, but a pine marten, wonderful, sinewy, nosy, just a heck of a character with that glint in the eye, a very, very mischievous glint in the eye. And we're quite lazy here on the Ardnamurchan. We don't actually go out looking very hard for pine martens out in the woods. We cheat and we feed them outside the bunkhouse, and they come and see us most evenings. And sometimes we get lovely views like this. Matt just showed a lovely shot of a golden ringed dragonfly. Well, because we've got the acidic sort of areas up in this part of Scotland, then again, golden ringed dragonfly is a difficult creature to see up there because the flight periods are very, very short. But we do come across quite a lot of insects, including the great pied hoverfly, which is the biggest hoverfly in the UK. You can see it feeding on devil's bit scabious, which is a very important flower in this part of the world. And on the right tours, particularly in the summer tours, we do see an array of insects. It does require sunshine, of course, but we do know where to go to find some of the lovely butterflies. This one's a small copper, and this is more of a sort of a regional specialist, which is a Scotch Argus. Sort of some similarity with the browns we're perhaps more familiar with down south, but the Scotch Argus is a late flying, very dark butterfly. And perhaps the one that most people want to see, because in this particular area of Scotland, there are quite a number of sites of the checkered skipper. And Arundel Woods is one of the places we actually go to, but we have actually found them in a small oak woodland very close to our accommodation. So with a little bit of effort, we should see, in the right time of year, we should see checkered skippers on some of the summer tours. Grayling, we've already seen a picture, I think, from Sue, from a grayling, and they tend to be quite coastal in this part of the world. So, and again, warm sunshine required, but we can see these as well. So perhaps you don't always think of Scotland as being a place you would go for insects, but in this part of the world, it's mild up there, it's very rarely cold, very little in the way of frosts, and indeed all the way through the spring to the autumn, although it can be wet, it's very rarely cold. So insects actually cope very well, and this is a dark green fritillary on a buddleia. Okay, a sort of few of the big beasts. This isn't a wild animal, of course, and these days you see Highland coos all over the place, or Heelan coos, as they say up there. But nevertheless, we do come across these animals pretty much all over the place on the Ardnamurchan. They do a very good job of actually eating some of the tougher sward around the coastal areas. Okay, so I mentioned pine marten. I suppose this is the other one everybody wants to see. Yes, you can go to Mull, you can go to the Shetland Isles, lots of places now where you can see otters. Bit of a success story in the last decade or so around the UK, but probably Loch Sunart has a greater concentration of otters than anywhere else in the UK, basically 1 per mile. Doesn't always make it easy to find one, but just occasionally you do get some really nice close views. I mentioned Aperitif Point. This is a pet name for a little location just down from Glenborrow, where we tend to walk out in the mornings. And these are the views that we have obtained in the past couple of years. So plenty of otters there, just need to find them and get a good view. Marvelous creatures. Yes, he's there again, the pine martin. And again, this is a shot that I took just through the window of our accommodation. So it just gives you the idea of how close you can be. The last year or so, we've actually had pine martins on the windowsills, running up and down, and we've been, some other tour leaders have actually had them coming inside the open door. So it just gives you an indication of how brazen they are. They know the food's there. They're not worried about us. They're more worried about other pine martins and foxes, but they come in for the food very easily. The whole area is a beautiful, almost mystical place. Very few people visit there, very few tourists. The few people that do visit the Ardnamurchan Peninsula tend to be the eco-tourists or into history. This is Swaddle Bay, which had a magnificent find of a buried Viking longboat a number of years ago, and further work has showed the various Viking burial sites all around this bay, and was probably one of the first places in northwest Scotland where Vikings came into, and a great place for things like white-tailed eagles and otters and twite, and used to be corncrakes as well. So just another little sort of backwater. At our accommodation, we get red deer coming in trying to pinch the pine marten food sometimes. We don't drive them away. If they want to come on the grass lawn outside, we'll happily go out to them. And for the first time this year for me, or sorry, last year for me, I was actually mugged by a red deer that pinched the peanuts while I still had them in the bowl. So that wasn't quite according to plan, but I do have witnesses to that. A few oddities up there. It seems these days you can't go around the UK without seeing introduced species. And this is a Pierre David deer stag. So this is an animal that originates from China. And when the species went extinct in the wild, the Pierre David deer ones in captivity were distributed all over the world to try and improve their breeding success, which has been achieved now. And there is now a wild population back in China. But there is these little areas of Pierre David deer dotted about, and there's a small herd actually at Glenborrow above where we stay. The autumn visits tend to be perhaps more associated with mammals than birds, but of course the fungi come out in force in the autumn as well, with the moist environment. And I just have to say that, you know, on a decent day, it's just a marvelous place for great views. If you're into volcanoes, into granite, into geology as such, it's a fascinating place. And probably the best preserved caldera in the UK is actually on a road that goes out to Sana on the north coast of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. It's not always easy to appreciate as to where you are in the caldera, but there's some amazing maps and models which you can see in the visitor centres there, which give an indication of where you are on this massive volcano. Being next to the sea, other sea animals include common seals. They're quite common. The grey seals are much scarcer for some reason, but the common seals or the harbour seals are relatively common. We get very, very close views of them. Wading birds, including curlews, still in reasonable numbers there on the small estuaries, and they breed on the moorlands up there. And it is an opportunity to, when we go out onto the with the boats onto the sea loch, and to encounter things like flocks of gooseanders, which is not a very common sight for me, I have to say. And then when we go a little bit further out to the mouth of Loch Suna and out onto the Hebridean Sea, perhaps on our way to one of the islands, come across rafts of Manx shearwaters, which is always a delight to see. There's a very large colony of Manx shearwaters which breed on Rom, which is just a few miles away from the Ardnamurchan, so we see them quite regularly on our sea watches. When we're out on a boat, you're never quite sure what you're going to see next, and just occasionally you get a lovely view of quite a common bird that nonetheless looks very special. And this is an out of breeding plumage common guillemot, which I was very pleased to photograph. For me, as I said before, once the cetaceans get into action, I'm afraid that the birds possibly take a back seat. There's very few other creatures will do that. There is a healthy population of common dolphins out there, and when we do go on our boat trips, we do stand a chance of actually seeing these wonderful animals. Scenery, as I've mentioned before, the history, the geology, it all combines to make this a very interesting place indeed. This is Kamanagao, which is a very interesting little bay. It would appear now from some of the digs that have been going on over the last few years that there's a whole massive history associated with this that now possibly puts back when the first humans arrived here. It's now thought that they arrived here within years of the Ice Age departing these shores, which wasn't actually that very long ago. So lots of new finds going on here all the time. But this area here was deemed to be one of the first areas of habitation on the peninsula itself. The big hill over on the Ben Hiant is the biggest hill on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. Heavily grazed with sheep and deer. Used to be thousands and thousands of rabbits, but sadly they've died out now. And in this area, you know, we're in northwest Scotland now. We're looking for the big birds of prey, the big exciting ones. There are golden eagles on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. Not always easy to see, and possibly not breeding anymore due to the lack of mammalian prey. But nevertheless, we see golden eagles on every trip, or just about on every trip. But a far easier one to see, of course, now is the white-tailed eagle, or the white-tailed seagull, if you like. These birds are doing particularly well in Scotland with the original reintroduction schemes. On every trip now, we're seeing white-tailed eagles, and all the tour leaders know where some of the nest sites are now as well. It's a big landscape. We don't always get incredibly close like this to some of these majestic raptors, but nevertheless, we do get some long, sustained views, off with them hunting or chasing each other, and often in company with ravens as well. And for me, pine marten, otter, eagles, cetaceans, seabirds, what isn't there to like? And for me, it's always a bit of a dream to go back to the Ardnamurchan. Going to finish with just a last picture, just showing, if you like, the contrasting weather that we have upon the Ardnamurchan. It seems to me that you can look to your left and it's sunshine, look to your right, it's pouring with rain, and in the middle it's doing something different again. But this is just a rainbow and a little bit of sunshine over Loch Sunart. It's a wonderful place to go, and I would say to anybody who's interested in nature, into wildlife, into conservation, make the effort, go to the Ardnamurchan Peninsula at least once in your time. Thank you for listening.